a state of perpetual endless war when you continue to assume that war will get you out of it.
This is Fortress on a Hill. Thank you for joining us. I'm Henry.
And I'm Danny. Now, let's get started.
All right, listeners, so we've got Greg Daddis with us today as our guest, and we're really lucky to have him. He's an associate professor of history and the director of Chapman University's master's program in War and Society. He joined the Chapman University faculty after having served as the chief of the American History Division, my boss, in the Department of History at the United States Military Academy at West Point. He's a retired U.S. Army colonel. He has served in both Operations Desert Storm and Iraqi Freedom. Daddis specializes in the history of the Vietnam Wars and the Cold War era. He has authored 4 books, most recently Withdrawal, Reassessing America's Final Years in Vietnam, and then 2014's Westmoreland's War, Reassessing American Strategy in Vietnam, and 2011's No Shore Victory, Measuring U.S. Army Effectiveness and Progress in the Vietnam War. He's also published several op-ed pieces commenting on current military affairs and strategy, to include writings in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and National Interest Magazine. Full disclosure, Colonel Daddis was my boss and mentor when we both taught at West Point, so any factual errors, faulty conclusions, or general failings on my part are really his fault. So keep that in mind. Well, thanks for being with us, Greg.
Yeah, it's a privilege. Thanks so much for having me on.
Still weird calling you by your first name, but it's growing on me.
All right, that's good.
See, that's what we call winning, Henry.
That's right.
All right, sir. Well, Greg, will you? So I know you don't like talking about your own career, which is one of the reasons I like you. But would you mind giving us just a brief rundown of your personal career path and what the most influential and meaningful assignments were for you?
Sure. Yeah, you want to start with a conversation in mediocrity, I say so.
I prefer that.
Right. So I went to West Point, graduated in '89, commissioned as an armor officer, yet never served in an armor battalion. I was served in cavalry units for all of my operational assignments. And then just had the good fortune of kind of bouncing back and forth between West Point and the operational army, and having an opportunity to not only serve in the field army, but then kind of bring those lessons back into the academy. And for me, I think that was the best part of it, was to kind of go back and forth and really be able to take some of the perspective that I had learned in the field force and bring that back to West Point. In terms of I think, most meaningful assignment, I would say I was immensely fortunate, because I found that the best assignment I had, and I think this was fortunate, always seemed to be the one that I was in. And I think that's probably why I stayed in as long as I did. So, I was fortunate to have a great platoon as a platoon leader and a cavalry troop commander in 3rd ID at Fort Stewart. I learned an incredible amount as an S3 in a CAV squadron in Korea. Saw a completely different side of the Army as a command historian in Iraq, and obviously it's just an immense honor and privilege to be in the faculty at West Point. And the reason I wanted to just start off with that, this idea of the best assigned being the one I was in, because I actually had a boss who we were talking about assignments, and he said that he was kind of reflecting on his own career, and said that it was just one assignment he had, and it was 10 years ago, and he was kind of talking wistfully about this great assignment I had. And as he was talking, it was kind of sad in a sense, right? That his best assignment was almost a decade ago, and yet he had stayed in the Army. And so I think that it was kind of a lesson for me, both professionally and probably more importantly personally, that the best thing you're doing should be the thing you're doing right now in the moment. as opposed to something you did 5-10 years ago. And so for me, it was just a good learning moment as both an officer and I think just as a person to relish the moment you're in and not be beholden to some assignment you had 5-10 years ago.
Yeah, it's pretty common for, some officers to sort of live in the past and be caught up in whatever they presume their glory days were. But it's just a great attitude to have. And it was clear to me when you were, division head at West Point that you loved doing what you were doing there. And then that just kind of like filtered through the entire unit. So that's that's the smoke up your ass for the day. But it's such a great point. And I remember reading your not your first book. Well, yeah, your first book on Vietnam, No Short Victory, when I was in grad school. And I knew you were at West Point. I didn't know you were going to be leading the division that I was in at that time. And I found myself thinking, why is he studying this? I mean, obviously Vietnam is super interesting. I mean, people read books about it all the time, but as he went into like the academic field,
right,
and did some real scholarship, why did you choose the Vietnam War? What kind of led you to this topic?
Initially, I didn't. I got my master's degree at Villanova and had the opportunity to work with Russell Weigley, who was in at Temple, kind of one of the father of American military history studies. Had wrote the obviously incredibly influential The American Way of War. And so while I was there, I actually did a lot of work on the interwar period. And it wasn't until I got back to West Point in 2003 that 2004 that was part of a study as the U.S. Army was then kind of engaging in, should I say, the liberation of Iraq, the voluntary liberation of Iraq.
It turned out well, I heard.
But as we were moving into Iraq, and I was at West Point at the time, there was a Special Forces Group commander that had written back to West Point, along with a number of other commanders. They were kind of using West Point as an opportunity to write some historical case studies that might help commanders think about some of the problems they were engaging in Iraq. And this Special Forces Group commander was on a second tour, and he wrote back asking for some historical case studies on how to measure progress and effectiveness in an unconventional environment. And a colleague of mine got together and I did the Vietnam case study, U.S. Army in Vietnam. He did the French experience in the French Indochina War. And it was really eye-opening in the sense that the narrative that was throughout much of the scholarship on Vietnam was so at incredible odds with what I was seeing in just the short amount of research I was doing for this project. So when I was given the opportunity to stay on at West Point and then go to University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill to get my PhD, it just was a natural fit to kind of explore why the narrative, the accepted narrative of body counts being the sole metric of an army that was wedded to this conventional concept that all it cared about was killing the enemy because it had no other scorecard, like geography as an example in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
That was wrong, that the documents said, in fact, just the opposite, that the Army was engaged in this overarching attempt to measure progress and effectiveness in combat, in development issues, in the economy, in the political contest in the countryside and in the urban centers. And what I found was, in fact, just the opposite of what the histories were saying, that it wasn't just body count that was the metric, that in fact the Army was engaging in this data collection effort that just consumed them. And so to me, it said something larger about the problem of Vietnam, and that's why I've stayed so interested since, is that it's such contested history, right? That there's debate on nearly every aspect of this war. And a lot of that debate then turns into a contest over not just the memory of the Vietnam War, but I think the memory of who we are as Americans and our very identity, that there's debates about patriotism and a sense of who we are as Americans at home and abroad. There's clearly a debate that continues to rage about whether we won or not, or whether the war was winnable. There's issues, I think, about the limits of power, which you and I both have talked about in more current day affairs that we're wrestling with. So to me, the reason why I've stayed with Vietnam, I think, because it offers so much, and because it's such a hotly debated um, moment in our time that continues to resonate throughout the decades.
Yeah, especially within the military, which kind of got me thinking. You graduated West Point in 1989. About what percentage of your tactical officers and instructors at the time were Vietnam veterans, and what was the prevailing narrative or the influence of Vietnam on those officers?
Yeah, it was palpable. I mean, when I deployed to Desert Storm, I still had a scout section sergeant that was a Vietnam veteran, and so I had a number of professors, especially senior academy professors that were Vietnam veterans. The head of the history department, Bob Doty, was a veteran. The superintendent, Dave Palmer, was a Vietnam veteran. In fact, I remember in our history of the military art course my senior year, we read Palmer's Summons of the Trumpet,
Wow.
which tells a very specific story about Vietnam. And much of it is this triumphal narrative that the U.S. Army had succeeded on the battlefield, that there was this kind of stab in the back theory that despite these battlefield victories in Vietnam, that the American home front had turned against the Army, that the media was complicit in this kind of anti-war activism that was pervasive at the time, that these weak-kneed politicians had pulled us from victory right at the moment when we were on the cusp of all-out success. So it was very much a part of who I was growing up in the 1980s as a cadet, and all of that I think filtered into how we saw ourselves at the end of the Cold War, because I think that Vietnam syndrome was still very much prevalent.
And by the time I was a cadet and graduated in 2005, I think there was only 2 Vietnam or 3 Vietnam veterans left in the entire faculty, and it was essentially the dean and the head of the history department, who was still there, Colonel Doty, that you spoke of. But I remember being assigned Harry Summers' book on strategy as a cadet in 2004, which really spoke to that same sort of we could have won, or
and
if we
should
had
have
only done more. Right, should have won.
And if only we had had a better strategy, if only we were more perceptive of the actual contours of the conflict, that we would have won that war and should have won that war. And that was the key takeaway. And I remember graduating West Point and having officer professional development sessions, and Summers was still very much a part of the conversation even into the 90s.
Yeah, it really is wild. And that's why we wanted to talk to you at this time about memory, historical memory with the scholars, but maybe more importantly, just the public memory of Vietnam. And you've already touched on this a little bit, but could you lay out for us just some of the general themes that have continued throughout the years as to how Vietnam's been remembered, and specifically myths and inaccuracies that are most common? And you've mentioned some of them, but maybe just lay it out a little more clearly.
Well, I think that's in part the challenge of studying Vietnam, and also I think personally the value of studying Vietnam is that, in a sense, there is no one singular collective memory. That the public memory of Vietnam, even the professional historian memory of Vietnam, that's a battlefield in and of itself, and there are so many landmines out there when we think about what Vietnam means for us. And in part, I think that collective memory is contested because there are so many constituencies at odds with each other, right? You've got anti-war activists who saw this conflict as immoral and, if not illegal. You saw journalists who were trying to get a sense of what we were doing in Southeast Asia, and seeing dichotomies ranging from the rural population to the urban centers in Saigon and other major cities, hearing what soldiers were saying, and those reports from the field being at odds with MACV headquarters. You see officers like Harry Summers and Dave Palmer who were looking back on the war, and still look back on the war as, again, this kind of great crusade, that this noble cause, as Reagan coined it. If only we had civilian policymakers who were able to stick it through. You see the policymakers themselves who, in their memoirs and other writings, are trying to demonstrate that this was an important war, that it was a war that needed to be fought in the larger Cold War construct. And then obviously, I think you see the veterans themselves who are trying to establish a certain memory of the war, to help make their sacrifices make sense, and for those sacrifices to have meaning. I mean, just think about the debate over the Vietnam Wall itself, right? That just how we determined to memorialize this conflict is incredibly contested. In fact, the wall doesn't suffice at the end, that we have to have another monument besides the wall, the three soldiers next to the wall, to demonstrate our appreciation for the sacrifices of the individual soldier. And so I think this is important for us in two ways. I think the first is we need to be really, really careful as we look back on episodes like Vietnam, and I would argue as we move increasingly farther away from the first decade of our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that myths that come out of these wars are oftentimes based on a reductive view of history. And what I mean by that is that, if you look at, say, senior officers like Admiral Ulysses S. Grant Sharp, who is the Pacific Command commander, his title of his book is Strategy for Defeat. So there's very much a storyline in there that if only senior officers were allowed to fight the war that they knew how to fight, that we would have won. Or others who will simply blame Westmoreland as an example for having a wrong strategy, or Jane Fonda for being the traitor she was and turning the American public against the war, or the media themselves at fault. I think those myths are all based on a reduction of history to single point failures, right? If only Westmoreland had a better strategy, if only Jane Fonda continued to make Barbarella movies, if only the media was more patriotic, we would have won. And so these myths oftentimes turn into a search for blame. There's some similarities here, I think, with a lost cause approach to history that you find with Confederate veterans in the aftermath of the Civil War.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another historical case study that's amazingly, after 150 years, still contested. You mentioned the stab in the back myths that developed, especially among a lot of U.S. military officers, and sort of the would have, could have, should have won narrative. You mentioned that they're reductive and that they continue to this day, that they're pervasive. To push a bit further, what exactly is so problematic or dangerous about these pitfalls of memory? How do you think it affects us today?
So there's this great episode in Kaplan's The Insurgents, which is about the Petraeus, and mafia is not the right word, but those coin approach advocates that and the study of kind of the writing of the new counterinsurgency doctrine. And Kaplan lays out this piece. There's a Bush White House senior advisor, and he's visits Iraq, and on the plane ride home, he's reading Lewis Orley's A Better War. And as he's reading A Better War, he has this kind of aha moment, right? That yes, the war is bad in Iraq. Yes, things are going not as planned. Yes, the American home front seems to be turning against the war. But we have a historical precedence here that if we look back to Vietnam, we're in this post-Tet 1968 moment, right? And the same history is now in front of us, where General George Casey gets to play the role of William Westmoreland by fumbling through a bad war. We have a difficult moment in both wars, and then the savior general comes along in the form of David Petraeus, or in the case of Vietnam, Creighton Abrams, and the war is turned around to the point where we are right on the cusp of achieving victory. And so to me, this is the danger of misreading and reducing history, because that's in fact not what happened. That when Westmoreland is moved to become the chief of staff of the Army and Abrams takes over command, there is no brand new war-winning strategy that is put in place. He does not alter the trajectory of the war in any semblance at all. There is no new strategy that is implemented. There is no completely different approach that takes a losing war and puts it on the path to ultimate victory. And yet that's exactly the storyline that is told by the senior White House staffer that gives support for the surge historical credence. And so to me, that's the danger of kind of misreading certain lessons that come out of the history of Vietnam. That if we think that in this incredibly complex conflict, that one senior officer who was a tank commander in Patton's army in World War II has very limited counterinsurgency background. Yes, is Westmoreland's deputy commander for a year, so understands a bit of the complexity of the war in which he's fighting. But to believe the narrative where one American man, can come in and miraculously turn around a war in a matter of hours, sorely makes the contention that Abrams came in and within the matter of 15 minutes changed tactics and strategy, which I don't find at all convincing. And there's a danger, I think, in terms of thinking about history that way, especially a history that is so American centric.
Right, and it resonates, doesn't it, with
we
the
want
military.
to believe that. We want to believe that, right?
Absolutely, the military propensity to believe that, if leadership alone by force of will can turn the ship and change things. I mean, that's beat into us, and in some cases that's a good thing, but
it is.
It really does ignore complexity. And when you look at the Iraq surge, I've written a little bit about this. It's so obvious, like you mentioned, that people at the top of the Bush administration and at the top of a certain clique of army officers looked at Vietnam or looked at Iraq and saw Vietnam. And
right.
They saw the Democrats who were pushing against the war in 2006 that had just won the swing election against the war, which was really sort of a specifically an anti-war election. And then they said, well, no, we're not going to do what, say, Johnson did or what Nixon eventually did, and Vietnamizing the war or Iraqifying the war. We're gonna stay the course, and
right.
President Bush, of course, was willing to do that. It's extraordinary the way that they drew those connections, and
that narrative doesn't go away. That narrative doesn't go away. In 2009, when I was there as a command historian for MNCI, and we were leaving Iraqi cities. As I mentioned in the introduction to Withdrawal, the one book on Vietnam that's on the commander's professional reading list is A Better War. So even in 2009, when we know that we are not going to achieve success in the traditional military sense, that there's not going to be a victory as we would hope, we're still believing that a savior general will come in and save the war.
Yeah, it's really incredible. Henry, what's your experience been like with the Vietnam War and how you've remembered it and people have discussed it with you?
Well, I'd like to touch on one little point here before I forget it. I've always liked reading about General Patton, and these days the successes and failings of George S. Patton are there's the historic ones, and then everything else we can attach to his legend. I remember General Casey being a rock star among my fellow soldiers when he was in charge of the Army back in 2005. I feel like that what I'm trying to key on is that intellectual separation we have from the myths. It's easy for junior enlisted guys like me to want to believe in that. General Casey's going to come in, he's going to kick ass, he's going to do this. General Abrams is going to come in and totally wipe the whole strategy. But at a certain point, we're not having the academic discussion anymore. We're talking about sending real people to die. And I think that because we've become so attached to our legends, to our movies, to our Black Hawk Downs, to our Saving Private Ryans, and the reason I brought up Patton was when he pushed the Third Army into Bastogne. I remember in the movie, they made it seem huge. I'll do it in 72 hours. And those are the kind of things that the American people want from us, and it's impossible in combat. But unless you take an intellectual look at warfare from that standpoint, you're always going to have the haves and have-nots, or the would and would-nots, that are going to say we could have won, we could have done whatever. But the movie that I specifically thought about for Vietnam was We Were Soldiers. I've never looked into it too much behind the entire history around the movie. But if you were just to take the movie, just the feelings that are put out there in it of wounded soldiers, of taking a hill, charge the hill. I've never been asked to charge a hill in my whole fucking life, including in training, but we think of those things and we attach ourselves to them, to things of legend and things that are not real. And it's that much easier for leaders, for officers that are in command, when the whole army wants to go, where are you going to go? And they might even consider it a betrayal of their troops. How did you pull out? How could you possibly have pulled out? Like, combat is a plus or minus scenario. Like, it can just be easily decided. We flipped the coin, we sent the right general, and we're done. And warfare is not that kind of calculus.
Yeah, I think, and especially in the context of places like Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, there are so comparatively fewer opportunities for heroic leadership in the form of a Patton, and it's no small coincidence. I would argue that the tank battalion commander that leads Patton's army to relieve the besieged troops at Bastogne is a young lieutenant colonel by the name of Creighton Abrams.
Holy shit!
So that sense of heroic leadership is still present in the army during the Vietnam years, and I think is still with us today, right? That we all admire someone like Hal Moore, both in person and I think as presented in the movie. Westmoreland himself calls the Battle of Ia Drang an unprecedented victory that seemingly proves that the capacity of the American fighting man is right in line and up to par their World War II generation fathers. The problem, I think, in these modern wars that are either unconventional or a mixture of conventional and unconventional, you don't have that kind of clear-cut opportunity for a Joshua Chamberlain to prove himself at Little Round Top, or a Patton to make these major decisions that will have incredible impact almost immediately on the course of the campaign. And I think that's frustrating. I think it's frustrating for not only the commanders, but I think also frustrating for the soldiers themselves who are fighting and trying to reconcile how those sacrifices mean something in the larger picture. If the soldiers who are surrounded at Bastogne in the 101st are looking for an opportunity or a way to reconcile their sacrifices, they can do so by saying that we were the Americans who stunted Hitler's final drive into the Ardennes, that we actually helped move the Allies closer to victory. And I think it's difficult, in wars like Afghanistan. You can't do that.
www.fortressonahill.com. You can also find us on Twitter at Fortress on a Hill, or on Facebook at www.facebook.com/Fortress on a Hill. We want to hear from our listeners about the topics and issues pertinent to America's military and veteran communities. And last but certainly not least, analyze your news and its sources very closely. Verify everything you read. And remember that no one, no matter how powerful, are above criticism, especially those with the power to send others into harm's way. We'll see you next time.